Have you ever wondered if Jesus of Nazareth really existed, or if all we know about him is just the result of faith and tradition? For many people, just raising this question already gives chills. But what if I told you that, behind the prayers, the Gospels, and the letters of Paul, is there a historical puzzle that goes far beyond religion? This apparently simple doubt has echoed centuries between scholars, believers, and skeptical. On the one hand, there are those who see Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. On the other, there are those who question if he has not even stepped on this earth. And in all this, there is a richness of historical sources, such as the records of Josephus, Tacit, and the New Testament, full of clues, contradictions, and fascinating nuances. After all, we are talking about a man whose influence has crossed empires, shaped civilizations, inspired Abrahamic religions such as Islam and Baha'i faith, and still arouses passions in the 20th century in one. But who was this such Jesus? A prophet? A revolutionary? A symbol? Or maybe a puzzle that will never be completely deciphered? In this thought-provoking dive, we will explore not only the history of Jesus, but also his historicity, his impact on primitive Christianity, and the different forms as his figure is interpreted from Gnosticism to Jewish apocalypticism, from the canonical Gospels to the enigmatic Gospel of Thomas. If you are ready to get out of the obvious and discover the little-known layers of the most influential figure of humanity, hold firm. Because what's coming can completely change the way you see faith, the story, and maybe even yourself. You can't talk about human history without bumping into Jesus of Nazareth. Whether in classrooms, pulpits, or philosophical coffees, your name always appears as a central figure. The influence of Jesus is not restricted to Christianity. He is also revered as a prophet in Islam, as a divine manifestation in the Baha'i faith, and even as an ethical symbol in secular philosophical currents. This comprehensive impact even challenges even fierce skeptics to consider their importance, even by pure cultural weight. After all, how many names do you know that cross millennia and are still a staff around the world? But behind fame arises the question, who was this man who changed the course of the story? The story of Jesus, when observed under academic lenses, reveals a character deeply rooted in the Jewish context of the first century, a period marked by Roman rule, messianic fervor, and hope of liberation. It is in this scenario that it emerges, not as a myth out of time, but as an apocalyptic preacher, possibly seen as prophet or Messiah by his followers. Which leads us to question what exactly made him so irresistibly remarkable for so many generations. When we talk about Jesus of Nazareth, it is almost as if we were talking about several people at the same time. For Christians, he is the Son of God, the incarnate divinity, the Savior promised in the Gospels and announced in the New Testament. For Muslims, Jesus, or Isa, is a powerful prophet, born in a miraculous but not crucified or divine way. Baha'i faith honor him as one of God's manifestations, alongside Buddha, Muhammad, and others. And there are still more alternative interpretations, ranging from Hindu avatar to symbolic figure linked to altered states of consciousness. This mosaic of visions shows that Jesus is much more than a religious character. It is a mirror where each culture reflects its own longings. And even within primitive Christianity, there were already strong disagreements about its nature. Some currents saw him as a heavenly being that only seemed human, while others saw him as a common man chosen by God. This plurality paved the way for both orthodoxy and alternative Christian movements, such as Gnosticism, which emphasized inner knowledge. And in the end, perhaps Jesus is better known for what he inspires than he really was. When historians investigate the historicity of ancient figures like Jesus, they follow very specific criteria. The reliability of a historical source depends on how close it is from the events described, and if it was written by someone impartial. And here comes the first challenge. Jesus of Nazareth left nothing written. No scroll, no diary, no personal object. This forces scholars to rebuild their trajectory based on texts written by third parties, often decades after events. This does not mean that everything is theological speculation or invention, but the absence of contemporary records forces us to walk carefully. Therefore, letters like Paul, written only 20 years after the crucifixion, gain so much value. Already the Gospels, later and with divergent narratives, require critical and contextual reading. The idea here is not to discredit the story of Jesus, but to understand it from the tools that modern history offers us. And in this process, separating man from myth becomes a fascinating exercise and often uncomfortable. The first accounts of Jesus of Nazareth come largely from the New Testament itself. Although they are written with clear theological objectives, they are also important as historical sources. Paul's letters, for example, were written about 2 decades after the crucifixion and reveal that, at that time, there was an organized movement around the figure of Jesus. It is curious to note that Paul speaks little of the life of Jesus. His focus is on the resurrection and spiritual impact of his death. This indicates that the worship of Jesus was born more of post-death experience than of his actions in life. The Gospels Matthew, Marcos, Luke, and John were written between 40 and 70 years after the events. And even among them, the details of the story of Jesus vary a lot. An example? The famous mountain sermon is in Matthew, but does not appear in Mark, which is the oldest. These differences do not invalidate the value of texts, but show that there were different traditions circulating in the first century. Analyzing these documents carefully, as scholars of historicity do, is essential to understand how the image of Jesus has been shaping over time. Outside the Bible, there are also mentions to Jesus in contemporary or almost contemporary sources, and this is gold for those who seek to prove their historicity. One of the most cited names is that of Flavio Josephus, a Jewish historian of the 1st century. In his work Jewish Antiquities, he mentions Jesus twice. The most famous of these passages, known as Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man, crucified under Pontius Pilate. However, many scholars believe this stretch was edited by Christian copyists centuries later. Another heavy name is Tacitus, a Roman historian who wrote about the persecution of Christians during Nero's reign. In his writings, he states that Christ was executed during the reign of Tiberius by order of Pontius Pilate, which independently confirms the crucifixion of Jesus. These mentions are brief, but they have a huge value because they come from authors who had no religious interest in the figure of Jesus. They are like textual archaeological pieces, showing that even outside primitive Christianity, something about this man was echoing in the records of the time. Despite the controversies and the gaps in the sources, there is a basic consensus among scholars Jesus of Nazareth really existed. Most historians believe he was a Jewish preacher, active in the 1st century Galilee, and was crucified by order of Pontius Pilate around the 30th year. This conclusion does not come from faith, but from the cross-analysis between sources such as the Gospels, the letters of Paul, and records such as Josephus and Tacitus. Even with the divergences in the details, these documents point to a common core. There was a man named Jesus who left followers and impacted. What is more intriguing is what came later. Many of these followers came to believe that he had risen, something unthinkable outside the context of a deeply spiritual movement marked by Jewish apocalypticism. It was this belief in the resurrection that gave rise to primitive Christianity, even before any text was written. The strength of this conviction, more than any document or physical proof, was the engine that spread the message of Jesus. And then the story is no longer just about a man, and it begins to be about the birth of a faith that would change the world. When we imagine the early Christians, it is easy to think that everyone believed in the same things. But the reality of primitive Christianity was much more colorful and, at certain points, even chaotic. There were currents that disputed with each other not only about who Jesus was, but about what his message meant. This is where texts such as the Gospel of Thomas, associated with Gnosticism, where Jesus is not the crucified Savior, but a master of inner wisdom. No cross, no blood, only secret knowledge as a key to salvation. This kind of vision competed with the model that turned out to be official, that centered on crucifixion, resurrection, and the deity of Jesus. The disputes were so intense that, in the following centuries, many of these alternative writings were declared heresy. But they show something essential: the impact of Jesus was so great that different groups tried to reinterpret it in their own way. These theological speculations continue to this day, from those who see Jesus as a political revolutionary to those who interpret it as a psychological archetype. And every new vision reveals, once again, that this 1st century man never ceased to be current. Did you know that Jesus is also a central figure in Islam? In the Quran, He is called Isa and is recognized as a powerful prophet, born in a miraculous way, who has performed striking signs and teachings. But unlike the New Testament, Islam totally rejects the divinity of Jesus and states that he was not crucified. According to Islamic tradition, God raised him to heaven before his enemies could kill him. That is, Jesus is present, but inserted in a narrative very distinct from that the Gospels present. Baha'i faith also includes Jesus as one of God's manifestations, along with figures such as Moses, Muhammad, and Buddha. Already modern philosophical currents interpret it as an ethical symbol, archetype of compassion, or even metaphor of spiritual transformation. Despite these multiple visions, it is important to remember that the Quran, for example, was written centuries after the first century events. This makes your contribution to historical debate more religious than documentary. Still, these approaches show that the figure of Jesus transcends religions. He has become a kind of universal language of faith. In the end, Jesus of Nazareth became something greater than any biography could contain. With so few contemporary sources and so many centuries of theological speculation, it came to be interpreted according to the needs and dreams of each era. It has already been seen as a social revolutionary, a radical pacifist, a master of spiritual consciousness, and even as a symbol of human suffering. Some interpretations put him as the archetype of the hero who overcomes death. Others, such as the internal guide that arouses the divine in us. The truth is that the less certainties we have, the more space there is for meaning. Therefore, many scholars insist any reading of the history of Jesus needs to be anchored in his first-century Jewish context. He lived under Roman occupation, in a world full of messianic expectations, where ideas such as Jewish apocalypticism shaped people's worldview. Removing Jesus from this scenario is like trying to understand Shakespeare without speaking English. At the same time, it is precisely this mystery that keeps Jesus so present. It doesn't matter if you see him as Messiah, prophet, or symbol, he remains a bridge between the human and the eternal, between the floor of history and the sky of hope. And now that you have traveled this journey full of discoveries, what Jesus of Nazareth represents to you? A royal man, an eternal symbol, a link between heaven and earth? The truth is that, regardless of beliefs, the impact of this historical or divine character continues to shape hearts, ideas, and civilizations. Are we open to face faith more depth and history with more humility? Is there anything within us that also seeks meaning, hope, and redemption? If this theme has moved you, maybe it's time to review not only who Jesus was, but also who you are becoming. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is much more to explore, question, and transform. So if you want to continue this journey of knowledge and inspiration, you subscribe to the channel, activate the notifications, and stay with us. Because the next answer may be in the next video.